Hello, everybody, and welcome to the World Discord podcast. I'm Brian Endless.
I'm Joel Ostro.
How you doing today, Joel?
I'm here and kicking.
That is good. We are welcoming a guest back today on a slightly different topic. I'll let Joel introduce him in just a moment. We're going to be talking to you today about South Sudan. We already went through the main crisis going on in Sudan. There's also a renewed crisis in Darfur, and there is a crisis in South Sudan. And while these have some linkages, they're also all very different. Just a day or so ago, or a very short while ago, about a week ago, South Sudan's government announced it's postponing its elections that have been delayed several times until December of 2026 because of the ongoing issues inside of the country. There is violence, community level violence across a lot of South Sudan, 2.2 million refugees and 2.2 million internally displaced people. That's what an IDP is, Joel.
I thought I had a long day.
They've been displaced over the last decade. There's a lot of climate change problems, a lot of food insecurity, and violence that goes with it. So why don't I turn it over to you to reintroduce Joshua to our viewers, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, Joshua, you are our first return guest. So thank you for subjecting yourself to the World Discord podcast for a second time.
I'm honored.
In my ignorance, anyway, I won't foist this on Brian. I rather thought that we would be able to cover both Sudan and South Sudan in one episode, but that quickly became apparent that was unrealistic.
Yeah, I knew we weren't going to be able to do that from the start, Joel. So that's all.
Yeah, sure you did. Josh, maybe because South Sudan is such a new entity as a sovereign state, maybe you can start off by telling us what is South Sudan, why is South Sudan, and what's going. Just a brief capsule of why there's conflict there. Obviously, it's a huge question, which will be subject of the rest of our conversation, but sort of as an intro.
Sure. Yeah, and first, thanks so much for having me back. And it's a pleasure to be with you, even though the topic isn't the cheeriest that we could talk about. But it is important, and I appreciate that you're thinking and shedding a little bit of light on South Sudan, because it is a conflict that's somewhat falling off the radar, I think, largely out of despair and horror, probably, at what has gone on. But so as far as a brief history, again, the antecedents for all of this go back many decades. But in very broad terms, South Sudan, of course, is the southern part of Sudan. It used to be part of Sudan. But it's very different religiously, culturally, ethnically from the rest of Sudan. So that has caused problems, again, for decades. You could go back to 1955 when there was sort of the original uprising, a garrison uprising of Southern soldiers that sparked the first civil war, what's generally considered the first civil war. Then there was a second civil war that began in the early 70s when the president of Sudan, Meservey, he instituted Sharia law. One of the chasms between the South and the North is religion. So the North is primarily Muslim, the South is primarily animist and Christian, or Christian, I should say. And so obviously not only was it the Sharia law that provoked another uprising, but it was also the fact that Meservey was reneging on elements of the 1972 peace agreement that had ended the first civil war. So this war, the second civil war, begins in the early 80s. It goes, it's the longest, at one point it becomes the longest conflict in Africa, and runs for decades. In 2005, finally, after immense international pressure, the comprehensive peace agreement is signed that ends the fighting and sets the stage for a referendum that the South will hold in 2011 to determine whether it wants to break away, whether it wants to be independent. Overwhelmingly votes in 2011, as everybody suspected, to break away. South Sudan becomes the youngest, newest country on Earth. It still holds that distinction. it also, and I don't know how much further you want me to go on the timeline here, whether you want me to get into the current civil wars and et cetera. But that's sort of the backdrop to South Sudan itself, and again, that's obviously very quick and it leads a
Yeah,
lot of important
No, no,
information. But
no problem. That's a great background. Before we
yeah.
get into the current civil wars, just want to clarify, and we talked about this a little bit with Sudan. South Sudan is the part of the old country that is the oil-rich part, correct? But they have to pipe it out through Sudan because they're landlocked.
That's right. Yeah. So South Sudan, one of the great tragedies of South Sudan is actually a very wealthy country as far as natural resources are concerned. So it has oil, as we're discussing now. It's also very rich agriculturally. It could be a real breadbasket. It has immense, somewhat rarely for that area. It has a lot of water. It has an immense swamp in the center of the country. That causes problems if you can't harness the swamp, but the potential is there, right, to harness it, and so it could be very, very rich agriculturally as well. But yeah, for now, it's oil is the name of the game. Oil and foreign aid are the names of the game in South Sudan for now.
But so in 2011, after that referendum, uh, because I'm an ignoramus and know nothing about the region, I thought that was going to solve everything, at least for South Sudan. It would be peaceful and go along its merry way. So, what has caused the internal strife there? Because my impression was relative unity.
Yeah, it's it's easy now to criticize, right? And it's that classic, hindsight is 2020. With that said, there were just obvious, glaring alarm bells that everybody should have paid more attention to. I think people got caught up in the injustices that South Sudan suffered, and they did indeed face immense injustices. The North was so brutal and cruel to the South Sudanese, and I think that distracted people from some fundamental truths about the South. One of them, you mentioned unity, Joel. South Sudan has never been unified. Even while they were fighting civil wars against the North, they were fighting savagely among themselves as well. So one of the characters that we're going to talk about a lot, I suspect, is a man named Riek Machar, current vice president, off and on again vice president, just depending on what the current peace agreement is. But he is the current VP. Um, as far back as he was part of this South Sudanese armed movement that was fighting the North, but then he also split in 1991 from the John Garang, who was the overall leader of the South Sudanese resistance movement. He split from Garang along with another leader from the Shilluk tribe. Riek is from the Nuer tribe. The tribes are important here as well because this is one of the fault lines, right? But he split as far back as 91. He eventually came back into the fold. He's a total mercenary. He even joined with the Sudanese government for a while during the fighting. So he's just a complete opportunist, as is the current president, Salva Kiir. So the unity has always been a myth about South Sudan, deeply, deeply fractured along tribal lines. I mentioned the Nuer, I mentioned the Shilluk. The biggest tribe are the Dinka, that is, or people group, are the Dinka, and they are the people group of Salva Kiir, the current president. Riek Machar, the vice president, is Nuer. These two groups have fought each other probably since time immemorial. I don't know, but going far back as we know of, they've fought each other. Even clans within the Dinka, for instance, have fought each other. So this is a deeply divided society. Now, the other reality of this was it was also massively underdeveloped. In 2011, when it achieved independence, illiteracy was widespread. There was virtually no educated, no technical class. Um, there was virtually no infrastructure in the entire country. And again, even though the main fight had ended between the North and the South, you still had ongoing fighting within the South because they've always fought within the South. So that's what I mean by there were some very real red flags here. Red flags doesn't even do it justice. A red banner, spread across the sky, right? Like there were going to be problems here. Expecting this country to be a country, it again, we benefit from hindsight here, but we can also say that was a total fantasy. It was always a fantasy that this was going to be a viable state, and it hasn't been. It's very hard to describe it as a real country or a real state since independence in 2011.
So
You
sad.
mentioned the tribes here, but you also mentioned earlier that there's a religious split there
Right.
too. Does that play into the conflict, or is that more background? So it's Christians, I understand, and then a number of different animist, more traditional groups that are there.
And are
Yeah,
those religions are they cross-cutting cleavages, or do the religious divides split along with the other ethnic lines?
yeah. So the major religious fault line was North and South. That was the big one, right? And as well as the ethnic, and because again, the North is more Arabized, and the South is not really Arabized at all. It's sort of Black Africans, sub-Saharan Africans.
Yeah, and that was
Um,
Arabization coming out of Khartoum, which was the same thing that caused the Darfur conflict, just in different
yes,
parts of the country. Yeah.
exactly. Darfur and the South Sudan issue are very, very linked. They're parallel issues and a lot of actually overlap. So that the main religious cleavage, as I said, was sort of north south. The biggest, if you're looking for biggest cleavage, probably within the South, I think it's tribe. I think that's the real flashpoint for a lot of this. It's also personality. It's just guys who don't get along and hate each other and are personal rivals. It's always hard to quantify that, but I don't think we should discount it either. It's a real thing when you have leaders who distrust each other or even hate each other. That can move geopolitics sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think that's an element here. It's a competition for resources, of course. South Sudan is one of the most corrupt places on the planet. Even by African standards, it's extraordinarily corrupt. And so much of this conflict is rent seeking, who gets control of the big piggy bank in Juba. So that's an element. More sort of prosaic, or not prosaic, but anodyne struggles just for grazing land and cattle raiding is a massive part of this as well. Cattle are so key to some of these societies, and so there's a lot of raiding back and forth, and some people have posited fairly convincingly that just the struggle for cattle alone is sort of a major element of the conflict. Even calling it a conflict somewhat flattens it. It's almost like there's many different conflicts that
Right.
flow into this uber conflict.
It
And
sounds so
so,
familiar because sorry, Brian, no, but I wanted to pick up on that because as you were talking, I teach a course on revolutions and political violence, and one thing that has stood out for me in teaching that course is those sort of civil wars that extend over long periods of time often feature coalitions of convenience on one side or another. And so, what looked like a united front in a civil war, there was never the only thing that united them was the opposition to the Muslim North, the Arab North. But was it mostly over political power or control over economics? Like, can you identify what divided those personalities in their organized struggle against each other? Like, if you could say, if someone asked you to name the one, what was it really about that continues to divide them
Yeah,
now?
I'm always cautious about the monovariate analysis, right? The fallacy of the single cause.
Sure.
Because I think there's many variables here. But if you're saying, look, okay, yeah, sure, there's a bunch, but what's the one with the most
Driving one.
explanatory power? Yeah, um, I think it might be tribe. I think it might be tribe. Dinka versus Nuer has an ancient bloody history, unfortunately, and I don't. One of the problems of South Sudan, people always only talk about Dinka and Nuer. There's many tribes there, and one of the grievances of the minority tribes is that everybody only ever talks about Dinka and Nuer. But the reality is these are the two largest tribes. They're the ones with the most guns and are the ones who fight a lot. So I do want to acknowledge that there are many other tribes, including really important ones there. But yeah, I just think, and even when you say tribe, it's a little bit hard to
Yeah,
disaggregate that from resource competition, for instance, right? Like, so if they weren't competing over resources, would there be these tribal animosities, or would they be as severe?
sure.
Um, so it gets gray, but I think it's tribe, and
But in
part
their fight with each other, they play upon the ethnic difference more than the
yes,
resource difference or the power difference. That's kind of what I meant. Like what's the
yeah,
propaganda about? What's the yeah
yeah,
the,
good,
the
yeah, okay, got it.
mobilizing the
Yes,
mobilizing point is
they
ethnicity.
they
Whereas, like in
exploit.
China, for example, in that long civil war, it was about ideology more
Yeah,
than anything else, like between Chiang and Mao.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. So the leaders in South Sudan exploit tribal tensions for their own ends. So that's how they mobilize. So if
It's sadly classic in many places in sub-Saharan
yes,
Africa and others, with the elites using it to drive the conflict and
yeah,
using it to push the conflict forward. Yeah. I've got two questions. I'm going to separate them though, and maybe we'll do them at different times. The first is just a very quick clarification. What is the population like in terms of where it is? I think Juba is a pretty small capital city, right? Just about a 500,000 or so people, if I remember. Are there any other population centers, or is this more of a rural country?
it's a rural country. Juba is the capital. Obviously, there's some other. I don't want to say big cities because even Juba is not a big city, but larger settlements or towns. But it's very rural. A lot of farm people, very very dependent on agriculture, fishing. I referenced the swamps, so people fish in the swamps and some of the other areas where you can fish. It's landlocked, so that makes it hard for industry, even leaving aside all the other problems. So it's very rural, very agricultural
And
based.
we'll talk about people being driven off their land. That makes it even
Yeah.
worse when all you're doing is working a small plot of land and then you
Yeah.
get driven off of it. Maybe before we get to the conflict, you can talk a little bit. I understand a significant part of this is the climate crisis is making things worse for everything. What are they facing? What is South Sudan's position in the climate change world?
I'm guessing it's not Ice Age.
Yeah. It's always hard to draw, a direct causal link, right, between, yeah. So again, South Sudan doesn't have the same problem that like Darfur does, right, where there's a really just a total lack of arable land, and
Yeah,
that is shrinking, and that exacerbates some of
yeah, nasty
the
desertification. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, South Sudan doesn't have that problem on that level at all. In fact, it has flooding is one of the big issues that it periodically faces, and that can be quite devastating. Uh, just entire villages get wiped out by these floods. So, and pictures come out of people canoeing, and you can just see maybe the thatched roof of a hut, and everything else is underwater. It really is that extreme sometimes. It's hard to know. South Sudan doesn't seem to be sort of a classic example of uh, where desertification or some other climate related issue is exacerbating things. If it's in the list of problems that is fueling, I wouldn't put it very high on the list. I think there are others that have much more explanatory and
No,
power.
that makes a lot of sense. Although, let's not downplay flooding. It's going to be one of the
Yeah,
biggest climate change issues, and people don't even think about it. Desertification, we know nobody can grow food and there's no water. When there's flooding, there's also no water because it tends to
yeah,
all get
you
poisoned
can't
very
drink it.
quickly. and you
Yeah, and
can't
you can't
drink it.
drink it. Yeah, it's unpotable, and it's really floods are devastating. They genuinely are. Like
That must
they're
frustrate the heck out of the North Sudan,
yeah,
right?
right,
Where
yeah,
we got drought, you got flood. Like, give us some of that water, right?
yeah, right, yeah, exactly.
Uh,
So, Joshua, let's maybe get into the crisis here. We've
yeah.
got 4 million people out of 10 million, either refugees fleeing to other countries and causing problems in other countries, and then half of those are displaced inside the country. What's causing it? What's happening here that's driving 40% of the people to be displaced?
Yes, so it is the fighting. Independence 2011. Uh, Fighting within the presidential guard breaks out in 2013 at the very end of the year, because the presidential guard was a mixed unit of Nuer and Dinka, meaning Riek Machar and Salva Kiir loyalists. Still unclear exactly what happened. Salva Kiir will say Riek tried to launch a coup, which is plausible, but subsequent investigations by entities like the African Union, I think the U.S. Also put out something on this, said there's no real evidence that's what happened. Another thing you hear is that the Dinka started to try to disarm the Nuer. Also plausible. So if you and you see how either of those scenarios leads immediately to conflict, right?
And just to
So
clarify, we're talking about small numbers of Dinka and Nuer here with larger populations
initially,
or farmers or other things. Yeah. Okay.
initially, yes. So this was a conflict in Juba. That's where the shooting started. Right, was in Juba. Then the massacres started almost immediately. Dinka going door to door in Juba, murdering Nuer. It really was that crude and brutal. And once that is like throwing a nuclear bomb on top of a an arsenal of other nukes, right? Like you're just blowing the lid off of everything. Um, just it's just like it's brutal. The level of ethnic violence was really extreme, and the stories that came out of the massacres, wholesale massacres on both sides. There are no good guys here. We shouldn't look for good guys because they don't exist. Uh, it's certainly at the upper echelon. I'm not saying all.
Yeah.
Clearly there are good stuff, but I mean the people behind this conflict, right?
Did the other side respond with those kind of killings too, or
Yes,
what happened
Yeah.
there? Okay.
yeah. And again, there's a long history of this. So I referenced Riek when he broke off in 1991 from John Garang. Um, One of the things that happened almost immediately was a Nuer army or a militia, really, called the White Army, because they daubed themselves in clay that turned white when it dried. They went and attacked a large Dinka settlement called Bor. It became known as the Bor Massacre. Um, we don't know how many were killed, but men, women, children, thousands. So again, this is just part of, you know, there was never any reconciliation. There was never any accounting for any of this violence. And even as you move farther and farther away from things like the Boer massacre, it still doesn't go away though. If it's not dealt with, it's still there under the surface, seething. Something happens and then bang, like all that anger comes pouring out.
And is that what the fighting looks like now? Sort of like disorganized and explosive, sporadic massacre kind of violence, or is there more? Is it sort of transformed into more traditional civil war organized militias? Like, because this sounds really disorganized, spontaneous.
Yeah, it had both elements, right? So you did have organized units that were fighting, but then you also it's a heavily armed country, and there's a tradition of calling forth. So Nuer militias, for instance. So this White Army I referenced, that's not a regular unit. That's something that a self-proclaimed prophet called forth. It's a very strange story, but he was possessed by something, he said, a spirit, and he called forth the White Army, which exists in Nuer lore. It's a known. He didn't make it up himself in '91. This was a known thing. And then they went and perpetrated the massacre. So you had these sort of spontaneous, disorganized, ad hoc militias, but then you also do have the SPLA, the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, which was the liberation army that fought the North. So this was an organized, even if it was a rebel group, it was still organized. And then it became the official military of South Sudan. So they were fighting some of the Nuer elements of the SPLA, and then but then you also had militias on both sides. Youth militias were very vicious and a major part of this. That again were rallied forth using these very chauvinistic appeals and harkening back to things like the Boer massacre or grievances that the Nuer had over similar massacres that they suffered. So it was elements of both. Now, currently, the level of violence is not what it was in 2013, certainly, and has been intermittently since then. So there was in 2018 is the most recent agreement. There's been so many peace agreements. They've all been broken almost instantly, like literally almost instantly. So the 2018, it restored a level of calm, but something that had happened was all these other groups had formed, splinter groups from, and various militias that are run. Sometimes there's only a couple hundred guys, but they can still create an immense amount of damage. And so you have scores of these groups all across the country. There's been this grinding process trying to bring them into the negotiations and the peace process. So that's been mostly a failure, frankly. And this whole situation has just dragged on and limped on. And people, I think, have understood that this is going nowhere. And my analysis for years has been there will be another really open war in South Sudan. I don't know when it will happen, but I think that I feel quite confident. And I try to avoid. We talked about this. I try to avoid making predictions.
Predictions.
I feel pretty confident about, because there's just been no reconciliation. Salva Kiir and Riek have shown time and again who they are, and the coteries, the cabals around them have shown who they are. These are ruthless men who do not care about South Sudanese people, other than a pretty narrowly defined group within their in group. And
utilitarian in that sense. It was interesting. You talked about the one religious leader. It sounds a little, and you made me remember. It sounds a little bit like Joseph Kony and the Lord Jesus Army out of Uganda. And didn't he go through South Sudan at one point in time in the last 10 years?
Yeah. So he's in and out. So he's mostly not in northern Uganda anymore.
He fled completely a while ago.
Yeah. I'm not sure if he goes back at all or not. I haven't looked at that in a while, but
I know a little bit of Uganda. I think Meservey finally got sick of using him as a foil and pushed him out.
But he's not a source of the problems in South Sudan, is he? Like, is he a cause of the problem there?
No. He's
go ahead.
Yeah, Kony was a strange guy. He's an evil man. I don't mean to downplay, but the phenomenon was strange, right?
I'm just wondering if people are following his model and if they picked up anything.
Well, the other interesting element of it, that White Army, I mentioned they daubed themselves. They're called the White Army. They daubed themselves, and there was a lot of this witchcraft of the type that we saw in West Africa, where this will protect you from bullets. Right, like these amulets and charms. That was a real feature of the fighting in West Africa in the 90s, where you had men who, like warlords like Buck Naked, right? That was his nom de guerre, and he was called that because he would go into battle buck naked because he was protected from the bullets. Like he didn't need anything, right? So, there's some of these traditional religions or religions sometimes manifest in strange ways around stuff like that, and it's South Sudan's pretty far removed from West Africa, but there are some commonalities there.
It really sounds like my assumption based in ignorance was an ignorant assumption that that a big cause of the instability in South Sudan it was mm, deliberately fomented by North Sudan. But it sounds like the problems are really indigenous, internal, without needing any external support, as it were.
Yeah, I think both are true. I think Sudan has played, clearly has meddled, but it was pushing on an open door, that old cliche, right? Like it didn't need to do much of anything because there were so many underlying grievances
Do they have a
and
side?
Sudan.
Yeah.
Uh, I think Sudan's primary concern. So yeah, they would have Salva Kiir would be their side because he leads the government, and their primary concern is the oil revenues.
Right.
Right, they
Flow of
want to
oil.
keep that
Yeah.
oil flowing up. There have been border disputes that continue, although they're not as
They were bad
violent
at the
as they used to
beginning, as
be.
I remember. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Well,
they've the Sudanese, Khartoum, such as it is now, right? Like it has its own civil war, but and Juba, they reached more or less of a détente or an understanding on some of these disputed areas. Nothing final, but at least they had figured out a way to largely coexist.
it's not what the fighting
Whereas,
is over. It's not
yeah,
about the
it's
border. That's yeah.
right, yeah, because initially in 2011, I mean, there was fighting
Right.
immediately in those ABA, and again because these are the oil rich
Oil rig.
regions, and
Yeah.
so that's at a very low simmer, I would say now. So yeah, Sudan would want Kiir probably, but again, I don't think they particularly care. Other than, is there something that can bring some level of stability to South Sudan so that oil can keep pumping up through our pipelines? And they don't want refugees. They don't want weapons for all the problems that come with conflicts, right? They don't want that on their southern border. They've got plenty of problems of
They got
their own.
enough problems of their own. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask a legalistic question for a minute, and then maybe we can get into the refugees and things. So Joel and I both teach genocide. I also teach international law. One of the interesting things about the
We
bigger
teach
picture,
about genocide. We don't teach genocide, just to be clear.
Yeah.
my students might differ
Here's how you do it.
But the result.
when you get enough expertise, what's the difference? So one of the most interesting things to me of the Darfur crisis was when the UN did their big investigation legalistically into whether it was a genocide. They decided it was not, that there were war crimes and crimes against humanity, but that it was political, and that didn't fall into one of the categories that was genocide. Is there anything similar in South Sudan? The way you're describing it, I can see where this could be taken as a political war between two groups instead of having an ethnic cause. Has anyone talked about that? Is genocide discussed here, or is it just too much violence that it's not a question right now?
Genocide was very hotly debated. Whether what was going on in South Sudan fell into this category. I testified in front of Congress once on South Sudan, and there was 3 witnesses, and we were all asked whether we thought it was genocide, and we all demurred actually because there is a technical legal definition to it,
Right.
and
I do that a lot, and my students hate it when I do it.
Yeah, exactly. No one was satisfied with our answers, but genocide is such a charged thing, obviously, and in some ways, though, it almost feels like a distraction, like the debate around genocide.
Right.
I'm not suggesting it's irrelevant. It's not.
It does, yeah.
But sometimes people got so caught up in, well, is it the G word or not? It's like,
Right.
well, it almost doesn't matter. Like the scale of violence is so severe, and does it
Catastrophe
matter?
is good enough to be
Yeah, like
focused on it. Yeah.
And also,
Right.
there are clearly war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I don't think that's a
Absolutely.
question. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and
But
ethnic
the one-
cleansing. I mean, it's hard to argue there was not ethnic cleansing. Now, again, it's not totally cut and dried because you did have some Nuer who stayed with the SPLA, like the Dinka-dominated SPLA, right?
Yeah.
So, and people can point to those examples, and
Yeah.
so
I think the one difference with genocide is the world has to act according to the convention. It doesn't say
Yeah.
what the world has to
yeah,
do. It can be a slap
right,
on the wrist, but
gotta do
I
something.
think
Yeah.
especially from the U.S. Congress perspective, that might be one of the factors that goes in there. It's almost a legal curiosity because I
Yeah.
agree, and we're all three of us are saying it.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter when millions of people are dying and displaced,
And
and
it doesn't have to
Right,
be root and branch genocide to be genocide either, but normally
right,
what they often look for is the root and branch genocide, and
yeah,
that's pretty
yeah.
rare.
Right. Like, so, Rwanda probably most recently, or maybe, maybe in the Balkans are some like sort of classic examples. But those are, as you just said, Joel, those are a little bit more rare because in there's so many factors that generally go into these types of conflicts, including in South Sudan. So even if tribe is a major, and I've said I think it's probably the major explanation, there's again so many other contributing factors that it's really hard to suss all of that out.
yeah.
Um,
And if
and
it's
again, in
political
practical
actors,
terms,
that's important. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, and in practical terms, yes, maybe there's an international obligation to do something, but as you pointed out, Brian, like nobody knows what that is. So I think even if you had said this is a genocide in the South Sudanese context, nothing would have changed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey
Yeah.
Brian, before we get to the refugees,
Yeah.
can I'm really interested. Um, can you touch a little bit like what has been the role of regional organizations like the African Union and maybe the UN or other external organizations in trying to, well, either fuel the conflict or douse the conflict, as the case may be. What have been the role of the external organizations that are relevant there?
So the region has been very concerned about this because they get a lot of refugees. So this could be a segue into the refugee discussion. But and again, I already referenced nobody wants the weapons coming across the border, et cetera, et cetera. All the problems that come with a conflict. So IGAD, the intergovernmental, it's like a regional body. It has led off and on the efforts to mediate a solution here without much success. In their defense, nobody's had any success at this. The U.S., with a few partners, have also been very active, in part because the U.S. was such a strong. South Sudan wouldn't have gained independence without the United States. So the U.S., it sort of felt like this is our baby. We gotta, we have a responsibility here.
And
The
Sudanese in the U.S. played a big role in that as well, right? Even here, like I remember, like when Luol Deng was a member of the Bulls, he was
Yeah,
very vocal and active for South Sudanese independence,
yeah,
and he had a
absolutely.
big group of Sudanese working with him to put political pressure toward
Yeah.
that end. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's been a UN peacekeeping operation there since the CPA was signed in 2005. So initially, it was going to oversee that transition 2005 to the referendum. Once the independence happened in 2011, then it was sort of reoriented to a different type, the UN mission in South Sudan, UNMISS. Um, I'm glad this came up because UNMISS is one of the most spectacular failures that you can almost imagine. Um, and I try to be fair, and I know it's an extraordinarily difficult situation, but you really do have to question what is the point of having all these peacekeepers there.
There's
There
no
have been
peace.
so many. Yeah, and again, in fairness, it's not a peacekeeping organization, right? Like what you just said. There's no peace there, so I think the world powers need to think much more carefully about do we deploy a PKO to some of these places. In some ways, it's something that the international community does to be seen to be doing something. They
Right.
don't have any other better ideas, so we're just going to toss a PKO in there and hope for the best. And this one was a disaster. It there were like massacres happened underneath its nose there, and it repeated the same mistakes over and over again. There was immense cowardice with troops Chinese peacekeepers on several occasions abandoned their posts, and left the people under their care to the slaughter. A protection of civilians site, which was where whichever group it was under threat would gather, and they would be ostensibly protected by UNMISS. There was a vicious attack on one in Malakal, and UNMISS did nothing. The POC was totally invaded, and just rampaged through. UNMISS did nothing. There was these appalling attacks in July 2016 against the Train Hotel, which was a known gathering for international workers, including Americans. The Presidential Guard of South Sudan entered the Train Hotel. A later report referenced that they were looking for Westerners specifically. They executed a South Sudanese journalist. They they gang raped women. They abused everybody they could find in that hotel compound. Literally, the reason that compound was a place that international workers stayed at was because the UNMISS headquarters was next door. UNMISS never responded to the attack the entire time, despite frantic calls. They could probably hear it going on. UNMISS never responded. Eventually, another element of the South Sudanese military came in and ended the original assault. Several women were left overnight because they couldn't be found. They couldn't be evacuated. And then a private security contractors from an NGO were dispatched to rescue them the next morning. UNMISS did nothing. I mean, it's just, I'm still angry about it, like 7 years later.
Yeah. This sounds like the worst combination of the 90s, Rwanda, Bosnia.
Right.
And really, you're reminding me of Somalia, where the peacekeepers were supposedly there to deliver food aid. But part of it is, and I'll be a little bit different from you on this, I don't blame the UN per se. I blame the Security Council member states who don't give the UN sufficient power to actually do this job. Because those are probably peacekeepers who are lightly armed enough that they could get killed if they actually tried to step in. I don't know, you might know that there's a stronger force there and that's under orders to not step in, which is just as bad. But, look at how Somalia, eventually the famine was alleviated when the U.S. sent in the Marines. And that could alleviate a famine, but the U.S. and powers use the UN to put Band-Aids on things that are hemorrhaging, and they just are horrible situations, and it leads to just tragedies like you're describing. It's just horrific.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is, and we've already been referencing this, some of these situations are war-fighting situations.
Right.
And when you put a PKO into the middle of that,
they're useless.
People, they have to be prepared to fight and die, frankly. And almost nobody is willing to do that and I don't blame them. I don't blame them either. If you're a Bangladeshi, and you're in, like, why on earth would you risk your life? I mean, that's insane, right? Like,
why is the African Union not taking a more active role then to try to? Because they have help.
Yeah, so the Afghan Union, the most aggressive Afghan Union mission is in Somalia, right? And that's a true war fighting. But the thing there again is, and here's a conundrum. The people doing most of the fighting inside of Somalia are neighboring countries who have suffered from Somalia's dysfunction, and specifically Al-Shabaab. They have real motivation to fight inside Somalia. Now, the downside of that is they also are pursuing their national interests.
They make terrible
meddling. Yeah, exactly. So you say, okay, well, we need
Well, it's an interventionist force, not a peacekeeping force. Like that operation is not a peacekeeping mission.
So then you can say, okay, we need neutral peacekeepers from another continent or something, right? So they're just totally disinterested. But then what we're talking about, unless they are a highly disciplined force, like Americans maybe, like the American military, which is trained no matter where you are, you fight. Unless they're that type, they're not going to fight. And I don't blame them. Like who wants to die on a dusty street protecting people you don't know? So...
And maybe just one last comment on this. One of the worst parts of sending in peacekeepers to protect people is the people think they're going to be protected.
Yes.
And then the peacekeepers let them down. And that's just another place in the long line of post-Cold War quote-unquote peacekeeping where lack of understanding or lack of political will is doing. All right, hey, we don't have
Yeah.
too much time left. Let's just get to the refugee situation. Maybe tell us a little bit of what it looks like. And you understand just massive food insecurity, massive shelter insecurity, both for refugees and internally displaced people, and then political effects in other countries too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as you would suspect, given all that we've described here, the displacement crisis is massive. Nobody knows for sure, of course, but it's several million at least inside of South Sudan. Uh, you know, maybe 20, anywhere 25, 50% of the population. Who knows, right? For sure, but massive internal displacement, massive refugee flows that now we're going over 10 years here for some of these refugee
Yeah.
populations. Because again, the real fighting in 2013 that broke out, that displaced a lot of people who mostly internally. That's usually how these things go. Most people are displaced internally, but then a subsection of those go over international borders. So you now have millions of South Sudanese scattered around the region. This is part of the reason that regional states want this to end. Now, some of those are in places like Kenya or Uganda. It's where you would expect the neighboring states. Um, and I don't see why anyone would go back right now. Some have,
Yeah.
but
Well,
given
and
the
their states don't have
dynamics,
any capacity to take care of people. They're at the
exactly, yeah,
they're basically at the whims of the international community, whether they get
yes,
enough food and other things, is my understanding.
absolutely. And so you're actually, as desperate and awful as these refugee camps are, you're still probably better off there
And they
than
are
in many parts
multi-ethnic
of.
at refugee camps, right? I'm assuming.
Yeah, so I used to work in refugee camps when I was based in Nairobi, and they have to separate the ethnicities usually, because you get real violence, and then even within those communities, you have to separate out some. So they have protection units where you have to send the particularly vulnerable, unaccompanied women. Man, like they have to be in like protected units. That How protected are they? You hear different stories, right? So these are desperate, awful places. Nobody wants to be there, um, but it
But
shows
internally
you
displaced
how
can be
awful.
worse.
Yeah, because the aid isn't reaching them in the same way. Now, again, even with refugees, there's problems with getting aid there sufficiently, but those problems are much more difficult in when you're trying to get aid into South Sudan. This this has been a challenge for years now, because it's very well known and very well documented to this point that so much of that aid gets stolen in one way or another. And it actually fuels the conflict, because
Hmm.
one of the prizes that they are fighting over is access to aid. Not just so when the initial fighting broke out in 2013, they looted the warehouses, they stole all the food, they stole everything to get their hands on. So and there is some elements of that continue, even though now international aid organizations have taken great pains to try to avoid that as much as possible. But just the presence of aid organizations presents so many rent seeking opportunities for elites. So in Juba, for instance, the trucking companies are all run by regime cronies, and the aid organizations have to contract with those trucking companies to move supplies and other things. Even the houses that expats stay in Juba, the prices in Juba are crazy. It's so expensive. So if you're an international aid organization, you're spending almost certainly many, many thousands of dollars every month, renting villas or whatever you can get your hands on that are probably owned by almost certainly owned by regime cronies. Any substantive business in Juba, especially Juba, is going to have to be tied into a patronage network somehow. That's just the way. You cannot operate otherwise. So and then there's also these even elaborate arbitrage schemes on currency. So international aid organizations bring in dollars, um, and the South Sudanese government required. I don't think this racket is still going, but this was probably 4 or 5 years ago. They required international aid organizations to exchange that money at the banks. They then artificially set the exchange rate low, so meaning you would get fewer South Sudanese pounds for your dollars. They would then sell those dollars on the black market at the actual rate, and so they had this really significant arbitrage that was going on. Impossible to know what the amounts were, but I've read reports that said it was many millions of dollars.
And all at the expense of the people, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Joshua, we're running out of time. We have this terrible tradition. I don't know if it was here the last time you were here, of asking one last question, and that is, if you were
when will it end?
if you were almost, well, not when will it end, but if you were almost all powerful, what would you do to fix it? Is there a fix? See, it's the impossible.
Joshua.
Yeah, it's such a broken society that it's hard actually to even think about technical solutions, because without some level of reconciliation among the tribes, for instance, without some sort of rule of law, without some sort of credible, legitimate local governance, I think I wrote a report about South Sudan years ago now. I said the U.S. should stop recognizing it as a government. It should sanction all of its leaders, like everybody. It should be absolutely as draconian as it possibly could, because it is the elites who are driving this. This is an elite war. Now, obviously, it's Joe Schmo on the street who suffers and dies, but it's the elites. And these elites, I said, expel their adult children from where they're living high on the hog in places like Australia and Nairobi and elsewhere, and posting on Instagram their flashy cars and flying first class and etc., while their countrymen are dying in horrific ways because of their parents' actions. When South Sudanese diplomats go to UNGA, say, okay, we can't keep you from attending a UN function. You may not leave a 1 square block radius of UNGA. You are not here to shop. You're not here to hang out. You're not here to visit relatives. Because what has happened, the response to all of what we've been talking about from the United States and from others in the international community has been statements of profound concern, lamentations. How could you do this? I counted this up and I wrote it down because I wanted to get it right. In this report that I wrote, I documented from 2013 to 2017, there were 80 U.S. statements about South Sudan. And that doesn't even include joint statements. Those are individual, The South Sudanese very quickly came to realize this is meaningless. We can do what we want. The United States will not do anything. And the United States is big brother to the South Sudanese. It absolutely is. It's the same type of relationship like with Liberia, right? But
we're just going to keep funding them no matter what.
Yeah, and they came to realize they could do whatever they wanted, and there were no consequences. You have to convince these guys that their lives personally will be much worse if they continue what they're doing. You can do whatever you want to their people. They don't care. They don't care about their people.
Yeah.
So they personally have to suffer.
About. We end up saying that, don't we, Brian?
Yeah, exactly.
So many conflicts we say that about. Just
some people. Some people have floated a UN trusteeship of South Sudan. I remember it was a report written around the same time mine was, when there was a lot of thought about what we do about South Sudan. And I found that pretty convincing, actually, although the UN has messed up so badly in South Sudan. I'm like, oh my gosh, do we really want to put them in charge?
Right. But you got to get back to fighting to do that too, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's the level of dysfunction we're talking about here.
Wow.
I think it's a failed state by almost any honest measure. And, I'm sorry to be so negative, but
realistic.
It's tragic because, the South Sudan, it's the ordinary people, as always, who are being devastated by the selfishness and the violence of cliques of men at the top.
And indeed, Joshua, I think Brian would agree that that's why we do this podcast, because in all of these situations, as you put it, it's the average Joe who bears the brunt of the pain, the suffering, and hardship that seems to go on, particularly in intractable conflicts like in Sudan and South Sudan. Joshua, Meservey, really, your expertise has been invaluable. I learned so much from both of these conversations, especially this one. Thank you so much for coming back and joining us, bozos, who on this podcast. Really,
Thank you,
really
Joshua.
appreciate it.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me back. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
And as always, thank you for tuning in. Please uh, like and follow us, and share the World Discord podcast on social media so other people can find out about us. Andy Miles, thank you so much for producing, and we will see you next time.
Thanks all. Bye.
For now, bye bye.